Welcome back. We are doing part 2, Birth of a Nation. And this is an exciting part of the book. It's a significant section. It covers all of Genesis, chapter 2 through 50. So it covers a great deal of material. It is a larger section, so bear with me. But there's a lot of good stuff. Genesis, of course, means beginnings. There's at least 3 beginnings in Genesis in this section. First of all, we have creation, the beginning of the world, the cosmos. We have Adam, which is the beginning of mankind. We have Noah, which was a new beginning, where mankind is completely wiped off the face of the earth, except for Noah and his family, a new beginning. And then we have Abraham as another new beginning. His relationship and covenant with God is the beginning of the people who will become known as the Israelites. So let's get started. This section of the Bible is parallels a section of the life stages of man, and I call it birth. This is the birth of Israel. There is, of course, Genesis 2 and 3 start in the garden, so we have this place that's set apart by God, that God protects and provides for his people here, and unfortunately they sin and are expelled from the garden, as if being thrown and thrust into the world like a birth. This is a birth for mankind. There's a lot of words and imagery in this section of Genesis that remind us of birth, including, if you remember the story in the Garden of Eden, we have this motif of nakedness, the first breath of man, God breathing breath into Adam as he is formed. There's a naming sequence. Adam and Eve's eyes are opened, and that is a result of them eating. And all of those are motifs of birth. When a child is born, we wait for them to open their eyes. Their first desire instinctively is to eat. Of course, they're naked. We name them. All of these aspects of birth are present in this section of the story. Also, a baby has no self-awareness. And when Adam and Eve eat of the fruit, we're told their eyes are opened and they receive a sense of awareness that they did not have before. That loss of innocence is indicative of a whole new world that they've been thrust into, a harsh, cold world. And again, they will need the comforts, they will seek the comforts that God provided for them in the garden, in the world, and they will be much more difficult to receive. There's first use in this section of the Bible too. We have the first use of sin. You may remember that the first use of sin is not in the garden, but it's actually used with Cain. When God asks the question, where are you? And reminds Cain that sin is crouching at his door. So as we just look at the first use of certain words in Genesis, they help us understand what God means by those words, what those words mean in the context of the Bible. And so too is it with the questions. The very first question in the Bible is one we should look at. The first question in the Bible is actually posed by the serpent. Who told you that you shouldn't eat from the garden? Did God really say that you shouldn't eat from the tree in the garden? God asks 3 questions of Adam. Where are you? Who told you you were naked? God asks 3 questions of Cain. And then Cain asks a question of God. Am I my brother's keeper? And the rest of the Bible attempts to answer that question. It's pretty important to look at the structure, because it too is inspired, and it too has messages for us to receive and better understand God's Word. As we look at the human development themes, the conception, the birth, the infancy, childhood, adulthood, death, and afterlife, as we look at those 7 themes that form the structure of this book, we'll also be looking at moral development. And so now's a good time to consider that, as sin has now become part of our narrative. When a baby is first born, they're innocent, yes. They are also very self-centered. They are only interested in their own needs. They do not care if the parents are up all night, self-sacrificing for their needs. A child is not morally mature or mature in any way, but as the maturity happens over time, we start to see that self-centered behavior begins, hopefully with maturity, to be focused on others. And that's something that we're going to see in the developments of the stories and the narrative as Israel grows and matures. Moral development not only progresses beyond self-centered behavior, but it also is when a child, typically a child, begins to consider how their behavior impacts someone else, and they develop empathy, and they consider rules and whether or not they should follow rules and why they should follow rules. And then ultimately, as someone is considered mature, perhaps in adulthood, it is primarily because they are putting others before self, and they are thinking beyond themselves. And the ultimate example of this would be self-sacrifice. Not only do our parents sacrifice for us as children, and that shows their maturity and their love for us, but the ultimate example of that would be someone who gives their lives for someone else. We see this with police persons, fire persons, and the military, of course. But in the Bible, this is also seen in several of the people that are in the Bible, in the narratives that we'll look at, and ultimately in Christ. So that gives you a sense of where we're going. That moral development will run parallel to the life stages of man and the life stages of Israel. When you read Genesis, you see brothers. It stands out to you. We start with Cain and Abel, the first set of brothers. We have, turn the page, there's more brothers. Turn the page, there's more brothers. So we start to see Ishmael and Isaac, for example, Esau and Jacob, the 12 brothers, the 12 sons of Jacob. And then Genesis ends with the 2 sons of Joseph, Manasseh and Ephraim. So these brother stories that happen again and again, when we look closely at them and compare them to one another, we start to see developments. And we see parallels. We see reoccurring themes in these relationships. And one of them is that the younger is favored by God, not the older. And first blush, when you start to notice that, it might come to mind that the world tends to favor the older one. The oldest son is the one who inherits more, receives the blessing from his father, and receives the greater inheritance. So the older brother is favored in the world, but God favors the younger. And is it possible that God is trying to say more than just that? And as we continue to study and look again at those brothers' relationships, we start to see another recurring theme, and that is conflict. These brothers have conflict, and sometimes they're resolved and sometimes they're not. For example, Cain and Abel, the first set of brothers, clearly not resolved. The jealousy leads to murder, and there's no reconciliation, obviously, between the brothers, and there's no remorse on the part of Cain. And when we compare that situation, that example in Cain and Abel, to the Jacob and Esau story, for example, we see some progression. There's so many similarities, but yet there are developments of theme. In the Jacob and Esau story, once again, we have Jacob being favored, we have Esau being jealous, we have a murderous threat when Jacob tries to, well, he actually does succeed and steal the blessing and the birthright and the inheritance. He takes all of those things from his brother. His brother's furious and says he will kill his brother. And Jacob runs away to avoid that. And he runs away and stays away for 14 years, arguably 20 years. He comes back and meets his brother, a completely changed person. He seeks reconciliation from his brother, and he gets reconciliation from his brother, in part because of his change of heart. And that's another theme that we see. What is it in these brothers that reconcile? What comes before the reconciliation and the forgiveness? It is a change of heart. It is a desire to make things right. It is a strong moral development. It is another theme that we'll see over and over again that I call change of heart theme. So all of this is set up in Genesis. All of these themes we've talked about already have been set up in Genesis. Covenant is another theme that comes up in Genesis as well. Covenant is you will find the word covenant used 7 times in chapter 9 in the flood story, for example. This relationship with man and God is unique in the Bible. You don't see other religions or faiths have a God covenant with man. God is not going to step down, so to speak, and engage in a contractual relationship with his underlings. But in the Bible, in the first book, we have a covenant relationship set up between man and God. And that's another one of the themes that will follow through in this book. Before we leave this idea of brothers and moral development, I just want to underscore it once again, that we're looking at a development in moral growth in these characters, in these persons that are conveying the story. Adam and Eve, when they're confronted by God on their sin, they blame each other, and even Adam blames God. They blame the serpent. There's no personal responsibility taken. And there's no remorse. And there's no desire to set things straight. But as you continue to read the narratives of Israel's faith journey and history, you start to see that more and more we will see that the moral development of God's people will be set inside their heart, that there will be a desire to set things straight and a desire to grow and to take personal responsibility for what they've done. And Jacob is an example of that, seeking out Esau and being reconciled after all those years apart. And when Jacob is put in a position where he is taken advantage of and where he is tricked and where he has to live with those consequences, it changes his heart, and he comes back and he's able to reconcile with his brother. And of course, perhaps the greatest, certainly the longest story in Genesis, the one that is 13, 14 chapters long, the Joseph narrative at the end of Genesis, is an even more developed story in this regard. Joseph is favored, his brothers are jealous, they leave him for dead, they sell him into slavery, he is in the pit, and he is risen up to the palace, which is another one of the themes that we'll look at, is the low raised high, and Joseph is a great example of that. So he's in the palace, and he continues to stay in Egypt until the brothers seek food. They're not seeking reconciliation when they see Joseph, but they're seeking food, and God uses that situation to bring them together for Joseph to forgive them. And over the course of, as I said, over 10 chapters in Genesis, they do seek reconciliation. They are remorseful. They take personal responsibility. And it is at that point that Joseph reveals himself and a reconciliation is allowed to happen. The Joseph story, not only is it significant in length in Genesis, but it is significant too because in that one story is all 7 themes that we explore in this book. So when we get to part 7, we'll start to see those connections incomplete. But for right now, I just wanted to introduce to you the 7 themes that we will be looking at in this book and give you some examples and help you see that Genesis is laying a foundation for us to understand the rest of God's story.